Okay, so this is Regicide, which is the hot new 40k game that's not actually very new.
Okay, and it's about chess, I hear.
It is chess. Yeah, it's Warhammer chess. Yeah. Thank you to Gabe, by the way, for gifting us this game.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's.
Behind me, what do you see? Do you see an oven? Well, no, we're not cooking on it. It's not really an oven. Do you see a kiln? No, we're not hardening clay in it either, though the inside of that is baked to ceramic hardness. No, that is a furnace. I call it a furnace because it's being used to work glass. And experimental archaeology is being carried out here at Jarrow Hall in Tyne and Wear. Now, there is a problem in archaeology, and that is, what on earth were the Anglo-Saxons using in England between the 7th and the 9th century to make glass out of? Yes, I know, I imagine you've probably wondered about that too. Well, it seems that there was a glass shortage in this period. Now, there was a time earlier when the Romans were running things and the empire was big and there was an economy of scale. You could produce things like glass in vast quantities somewhere where it was easy to do so because you had easy access to the correct raw materials, and then export it in bulk for people to do whatever they wanted to do with it somewhere else. And it seems that in Roman times the key ingredient was from Egypt, and this was called, what was it called? Novo?
Natron.
Natron, thank you. It was called natron. And natron is a naturally occurring form of sodium carbonate. And you find this in saltwater delta areas near the mouth of the Nile, where the water is evaporated away, leaving behind crystals, some of which are this very good nitron. Nitron?
Natron.
Natron. I was so close. It's a new word to me. I've learned 3 new words today: natron, cullet, and moil. We'll come to those other 2 in a minute. Now, they really were producing this in staggeringly large quantities.
And there is no way to illustrate this better than to introduce you to the staggering spectacle that is the glass slab of Beth She'arim in Galilee, in what is today Israel. When this was found in 1956, it was assumed to be concrete because, well, that's what it looks like. But in 1963, they analysed it and found that it was in fact glass. And at that time, it was the biggest piece of glass in the world. Its exact date is disputed. Mainstream thoughts is 4th century AD, but there is an idea that this is early Islamic rather than late Roman. Anyway, it weighs a mind-blowing 9 tons. The ancient Egyptians had furnaces that made about 5 pounds of glass at a time. 9 tons! Enough to make 60,000 bottles. It was heated in a massive furnace with fire alongside it, which created a volume of hot gas trapped above it and held it at molten temperature for about 5 to 10 days, using an estimated 20 tons of firewood. By crikey.
So in the ancient world, they really were able to create these huge resources, and then it was cheaper to export them around the empire. And so that was what the late Romans in Britain were using to make glass. But unfortunately, the Roman Empire rather famously collapsed. Not exactly in 410, but after 410 things generally went a bit pear-shaped, and by the time the Byzantines are busy fighting the Arabs off, the supply of new raw glass coming into England has pretty much dwindled to nothing. So it seems that between the 6th and 9th century, the Anglo-Saxons were having to recycle glass over and over and over again. In fact, archaeologists have been dating and analysing glass based on an assumption, which is that the later it is, then the more times it's been recycled, and so maybe we can tell something useful about this. But can we actually? Is this based on good scientific data? What happens to glass of the period when it's heated up in a correct, authentic furnace like this? As it's remelted and recycled over and over again, how does its composition actually change? So the thing to do is science! Do some experimental archaeology, make an authentic kiln. This is not necessarily 100% authentic. We don't have very good evidence for this sort of thing. It's just clay and sticks and so forth. So these sort of things tend not to survive and tend not to be written about in any great detail. But as far as we can tell, this is what the furnaces would have looked like. And you stick a load of glass in, made very precisely to the chemical composition of the raw glasses that they would have had to work with. These have been heated in a modern electric emissionless kiln, which doesn't introduce any new contaminations, and then put it in there, heat it up, keep it at the heat for quite some while, and then have a glassblower come in, work with it, rate it, say how workable he thinks it is, keep samples of it, analyse those for their chemical composition, repeat, recycle and recycle. And this goes over and over again, and it takes a very long time because you have to keep the glass hot for something like 12 hours. You can't, with a piece of steel, you bring it up to working temperature, then you start bashing it with a hammer. That's fine. But with glass, it's not like that, because you get a load of broken, smashed up glass, and it's got air gaps in between it. And those air gaps, of course, when the glass becomes molten, become bubbles. And the bubbles take ages to rise to the top because it's so very viscous. At first, it's like thick toffee. And even when you got it pretty hot, it's still pretty viscous. So you have to keep it very hot for about 12 hours before you can work it. So that's the case today. That was the case back then. So glass workers presumably had to work round the clock, and they would have had family and friends stoking their furnaces throughout the night if they wanted to work in daylight hours, which I imagine most of the time they would. And so it was a laborious process. And so that's what's happening here. And so they are throwing bits of wood in every, well, when they're trying to get it up to full firing temperature, about once every 7 minutes you have to refuel this thing for hour upon joyous hour, drinking tea and eating cake in the meantime. But boy, does this thing put out soot!
Here you see glass of differing colours. The chemical makeups of the ingredients heated were all the same, but different bits of glass have been oxidised in the furnace by differing amounts. If the manganese in the glass gets oxidised a lot, it goes pinky purple, and a little bit less, and the small amounts of pink filter out the yellow, making it blue. With less filtered yellow, it looks green. Note here a piece that straddled the borderline in the furnace between the green and the blue areas.
And here we have some of the products of this furnace, which you'll notice are all a pretty consistent colour. These are called canes. It's just a rod that's been pulled out of the molten glass. These are the ends of the canes, which have been deliberately pinched into this shape, so it's easier to break them up again. And these were a palm cup, which is a type of Anglo-Saxon glass vessel from the period, but they've not been annealed. By annealed, I mean allowed to cool really, really slowly, actually in a heated environment. And because they weren't annealed, as they cooled, they snapped because it shrank too quickly for its to cope with the changes of stress. And another thing we have in here is a moil. This is a moil, and you may be able to see a couple of tiny little dark marks in it. These are contaminations that have been introduced by contact with some of the steel tools, the ends of the rods and the blowpipes that are used in glassworking. And the glass is so hot that when it touches a piece of steel, it can create scale, iron oxides, forming on the outside of that steel, which then contaminate the glass. And you end up with lots of moils, which are sometimes so contaminated it's just not worth using them again to make more glass things. So these get thrown away, and sometimes archaeologists find big piles of moils. Right, well, what do I have here? I have a crucible. Why is it broken?